Welcome, everybody. This is Jonathan Perez from Thoughtium. Welcome to Navigating Now, episode 204. Very, very excited to be with you today for two reasons. One, it's my first time hosting on Navigating Now, so I'm very excited about that. And secondly, because I get to bring on an awesome guest who I have the honor and privilege of having an extraordinary conversation. I'm already speaking as it's already done because I'm so excited for it. So I want to introduce Deb Katz, who is a coach, consultant, and forum facilitator at the Conscious Leadership Group. I've been aware of the Conscious Leadership Group for many years now, and I actually did a training with them where I got to experience deeper work with them. Deb was a part of that, and I reached out, very excited to connect with her, and she was more than happy to jump on with us and have a conversation around conscious leadership and how they do this work at the Conscious Leadership Group. So let's go ahead and welcome Deb on. What's up, Deb?
Hi, Jonathan.
Doing great. Good to see you. I know we were already going deep in the prep, so we're so excited. How are you feeling coming in, Deb?
I'm excited. I just thoroughly enjoy talking with you and excited always to share conscious leadership with folks who are curious about taking responsibility for culture.
Yes, so excited to dive in. Awesome, Deb. Well, I thought we would start before we get into the defining and going into the body of work. I would love to hear, I was scoping out on your LinkedIn that you've been, it's a little over 12 years now with CLG, the Conscious Leadership Group. And so I'm curious how you ended up with the Conscious Leadership Group and what is it that you love about the work that you do today there?
Yeah, thanks. It was sort of a circuitous journey. One of my early first careers was actually in the political sphere, and was highly effective, very mission driven, and got a lot done. And I count myself lucky that at some point my bubble got burst and I turned around and saw metaphorically fields of people I had driven through in my mission driven young leadership style. And so it really comes from my own experience of what I would call some toxic leadership style myself that took me a good decade of learning and burnout recovery to learn about self-awareness and collaboration. And so through my own toxic leadership history, I'd call it, I found myself studying with some of, I think, the great thought leaders of our time in culture. And so then I met Diana Chapman and Jim Duthmer long before CLG actually was an entity, and started working and training with them a long time ago, probably 24 years ago.
Yeah, awesome. I can definitely relate. And they're awesome human beings, Jim and Diana. Yeah, and I can relate to the experiencing the toxic leadership, well, not only in ourselves, but also around us, which that's one of the reasons I love helping people with leadership as well, similar to what you do. So beautiful. Well, I'm grateful that you're in this field of work because you're amazing at it, obviously. So we're super pumped to dive into this topic of conscious leadership. And before we get into unpacking it a little bit, I thought we can start with some defining, because I know that you all have your own definition of what it means for you all to lead consciously. And so I'm curious to kick everything off, like you were saying, at the 30,000 foot level, how would you define what conscious leadership is and what it means?
Yeah, that's important to do, because when you say the word conscious and you say the word leadership, people are going to have all kinds of personal experiences and definitions of what that means to them. So it's important to get on the same page.
Yeah.
So those are technical terms for me. And conscious, how we're defining conscious, is being here and now in a non-triggered, non-reactive state, which from the research of Gay and Katie Hendricks at the Hendricks Institute are suggesting most of us are actually in a triggered or reactive state more than 95% of the time. So it's actually like the normal human baseline is to be looking at life through these lenses of reactivity. It's normal, it's human. But it's not the only option. And so what would it be like to actually be in a conversation with a colleague, a family member, a direct report, a friend, who you're in a non-reactive state? Then how might you approach that situation? They're in a non-reactive state. Now the two of you, perhaps, what can happen from that place? So that's what we're exploring with conscious, is being here and now in a non-triggered, non-reactive state. And then leadership, also technical term, we'd say that a leader is someone who's willing to take responsibility for their impact and their influence. And side note, one of my favorite definitions of leader actually is someone who's willing to step into the unknown, someone who's willing to step sort of out of the script of their, I imagine all of us have this inner playbook of do's and don'ts. The do's and don'ts of how to be Deb and the do's and don'ts of how to be a Jonathan. But what happens when we step off that script is an unknown. And that's what being in the present moment is. It's actually the unknown. Right. And that's where creativity and innovation lives. So here and now in a non-triggered, non-reactive state, and willing to take responsibility for our impact and our influence.
Love that. Love that. And that was, you mentioned the research of Gay and Katie Hendricks. Is that right?
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, there have been mentors of many of ours, and much of the book is legacy from their body of work, and many other mentors as well. Byron Katie and Hale Dwoskin at the Sedona Method, many mentors and guides.
Yes, amazing. So yeah, being in this present state, and I'm not going to use your exact words since I'm just hearing here, but from what I'm hearing you say is being in the present moment, not in a non-reactive, triggered way. And then the leadership piece is, the way you're defining it, is taking responsibility for our influence in the world. And then you also mentioned being willing to be in the unknown, which I've been working with that one in a beautiful way as well. And I'm curious, Deb, can you paint a picture, whether from your experience or if you have an example of what would it be if you just painted a picture for someone to be leading unconsciously? So what, like if you had an example or something we can play with to where you've seen that you can contrast what it might look like to be leading unconsciously.
Yeah, well, if this body of work is based on the 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership, a book. And our platform comes from that. So if we look just at the first commitment number 1 is around taking 100% responsibility for our experience. And so what might happen is, I'm even just thinking recently, a client, we made an agreement about when they would show up to our meeting. We would show up at this meeting at this time, and we would end at that time. And then what happened was the client said, oh, now I have a phone call, and so I can't. And so, one of my team members didn't do their stuff like they were supposed to, and so I can't show up to our meeting on time. And so their reactivity is so normal. I mean, probably many of the listeners here today, the same thing happened to them within the last 48 hours. And so what we could see, though, is that client was in a state of blaming their colleague for not agreeing or meeting their agreement, right, to get some work done. And then they were at the effect of that. And so they couldn't show up on time because they were at the effect of that. All of that is what we would say is coming from a reactive state and not really getting that they, in fact, were making choices. And so we would say that might be something from a reactive state, or what we would call below the line. And an alternative to that could be something like, hey, Deb, turns out my workload changed. And what I'd like to do is see if we could renegotiate our time. How would that work? Or say to the colleague, hey, an agreement. There's just so many different options. There's like an infinite number of options that you could see from the unknown, from the non-reactive state. But when we're in a state of reactivity, at best, we can see two examples. I go do the extra work for my colleague, or I'm late or cancel a meeting with a commitment I already have. That's not a lot of choice.
Right.
So conscious leadership is getting more self-awareness so that we can get access to more creative choices. Of course, I just gave a really simple example, but more creative options for really handling some of the complex nuances of our work and personal lives.
Yeah, I love that. And so you're saying when we're in the triggered state, which I can relate to, right? To me, in my experience, the options seem very limited. And what I'm hearing you say, it's because we are in that triggered state that they become very limited in terms of maybe one or two choices. But what I hear you also saying in that moment, maybe it's if you come back to a more present state, or you come back into a non-reactive state, then the ways to approach the situation open up. So the possibilities open up.
That's right. And the kind of trick of that whole thing is that getting to the non-reactive state happens by going into the reactive state, because there's intelligence in the reactivity.
Right.
So maybe if we made this practical, is there anything, Jonathan, that, in your life right now that maybe you're just in a little bit of a struggle with, trying to figure out, which way to go in a particular area?
Yeah, I would say, I think the one is, for example, without going too much into the details, like with family, where wanting to see if there's a certain situation happening with my parents, just to keep it at the least. Yeah. Who of us is meant to come in and support, and also looking at who did what, who's doing enough. Should I do more or less? Should it be them doing this or them doing that? And I notice myself, and I catch myself more often now, but I notice going into that, well, I'm going to hold back because they're not doing enough, or they should be doing more to help. That's a present one.
Right. So then the focus of attention gets on to what other people are and aren't doing, which is normal, of course, to rectify the situation around time with family, time with parents. But the thing of that is there's nothing you can do about what other people are and aren't doing. That's out of the realm of our control. I think I spent decades trying to control other people and circumstances. And although I was able to affect some change, it was exhausting, not sustainable for me. And I don't think I built sustainable relationships at that time while in that mode. And so what happens when we shift the focus of attention from what other people are and aren't doing to ourselves? What am I doing, not doing? What am I saying, not saying? Am I in some obligatory situation? Am I in some blame? Because whenever we're in blame, even if we're not outwardly blaming, other people can feel it. There might be other families in your, family members. We're kind of getting a little bit of like, whoa, Jonathan's in some, I don't, like where we actually put people on the defensive just because we're holding an inner posture of blame or criticism versus holding a posture of, hey, here's what I'd like to create. And I wonder how we could have a conversation where we could hear all the needs at the table, all the wants at the table, and how do we get them all met? How do we create a win for all in that? Without being attached to being right, that the way you're seeing it is the way it ought to go, or being attached to being right, that the way other people are seeing it would be ineffective. Yeah. But how do we have these creative conversations where we take blame and criticism out and we bring responsibility in?
Yeah, and it sounds like that would be up to me for using the example, because I can sit here in the blame or the criticism, or take responsibility for perhaps how I can become the solution of the very thing I'm complaining about.
That's right. And in fact, what we see is we generally are the creators of the problems we're complaining about. And
It's a big
so
one.
it's not that other family members are or aren't doing something, it's how you're in relationship to reality, how you're being in relationship to what other family members are doing or not doing. Are you perceiving them through blame and criticism or righteousness? And if so, then what can happen is you can see, oh gosh, they're just being them. But what I'm doing over here is I'm the agent of conflict through my attachment to righteousness, through my blame and criticism. And so if we can get a handle on our own orientation,
Right.
then sometimes you don't even need other people to do anything differently.
Yeah.
So it's through the reactivity, not bypassing it. It's through the reactivity that we find the intelligence for the change we want to see.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. And I can see how when I started to realize what you're saying is that one of the most difficult parts is for me to take a responsibility for even how I'm contributing to the very thing as well. So I'm curious if you can speak to that a little bit, Deb, because I think for me, that's been one of the more challenging ones, because again, when we go into blame or criticism, there's this part of us that really wants to be right. And so the idea, I remember when I first ran into it, was, what do you mean take responsibility for my part when it's them? So
Yeah.
if you can unpack a little bit of what's the mechanism under that desire to be right and maybe resistance to taking responsibility for how we're contributing to a situation.
Yeah. You know, in the world according to Deb, in my little world, I think that the Western psychology, Western mind has gotten to a point where the fear of getting it wrong, the fear of failure is sort of on par at this point with Maslow type experiences and fears around, do we have enough money? Do we have shelter? Do we have food? That the fear of getting it wrong has gotten so strong that we just orient, particularly with, highly accomplished people, we orient to, I gotta get it right. Will I get the promotion? Will the relationship be damaged if I don't get it right? Will I be seen as all-in team player? And so what happens is people wind up getting themselves fixated on being right and attached to being right. And so as soon as I'm attached to my position, Jonathan, being right, now what happens is if you disagree with me in a meeting, we immediately become adversarials because I'm attached to being right. There's no room for you to have your opinion about the strategy we would take. And so all I know is that I'm now the agent of conflict because I'm attached to being right, that we ought to go the way I see it. And it doesn't matter what the data says. It's because I'm attached to being right and it ought to go my way. So now the chances of a collaborative conversation really decrease, rather than I could passionately advocate for my position without being attached to being right, so that then you could advocate for your position. And then what we put our attention on more than being right is what can we learn from what's in the room? What can we learn from all the points of view in the room without being attached to being right? So that we prioritize learning and growth over being right. And that actually is commitment number 2 in the 15 commitments, is that when we're in a reactive state, we get very attached to being right. And we get a lot of kudos for that culturally as well. But what we'd say is you can't be in a state of presence and attached to being right at the same time, in a way where conscious leaders we're disinterested in blame and criticism. We're disinterested in who's right. We just want to learn. What's in the room? How do we learn? How does that inform? How is that the data set for the next move, if there's a next move?
Yeah, that's awesome. And also one of the objections that's coming up and I used to have this one, but when I share this idea, it comes up as well. Maybe I'll throw the question at you, like if I was, well, Deb, what if I am right?
Yeah, that's great. So then we bring in another one of our tools, which is let's get on the same page about what facts are and what stories are. Because a lot of time, and probably you and many of the audience know, there's this idea about story wars. And so much of the time, people are having conflict, arguing about stories as if they're facts. And so if we can get an agreement around what is a fact and what is a story. So if we really make this simple, right, it could be something like 2 + 2 is 4. Very simple example here. Does anyone even want to argue? Like, do we even want to put any time into does 2 + 2 equal 4? What a waste of time and energy. We have agreement that that's a fact. But if you and I look at a report and that report says simply 2 + 2 equals 4, and I read the report and I say, based on 2 + 2 equals 4, clearly we need to go in this direction. You read the report, same report, says 2 + 2 equals 4. And you say, clearly that means we need to go in that direction. Now, if we're not on the same page around the fact is 2 + 2 equals 4, and what we say a fact is anything a camera would record is a fact, and a story is everything else. And so 2 + 2, we don't want to argue about that. It's a waste of time, unless we're talking to the quantum physicists. But in terms of everyday life, what I'm going to do with 2 + 2 equals 4 is a story. It's subjective. And we can be passionate and we can care deeply, and we often do care deeply about the strategy we want to employ, but it's still a story.
Right.
Then I know I'm not right. It's just the direction I want to go in. So then it might open my ears a little more to how are you being with 2 + 2 equals 4 and the strategy you want to employ. So now we can get into story creativity. What do we want to do with the facts rather than story wars? And so I can show up in the conversation. Maybe you would show up in the conversation less attached to our stories being right, because they're not. They're arguable. And we can just play with our stories together, put it up on the wall, take a look at it instead of arguing. We can stand shoulder to shoulder and say, yeah, 2 + 2 equals 4. Let's take a look at it from here. Let's take a look at it from here, without being attached to being right. And then bringing some adversarial energy, really bringing more allyship to the conversation.
Yeah. So facts versus story. Yeah. And I remember when I first, it was in the book, when I first saw that tool, it becomes very easy to just draw it out, right? So we don't have to go through it now, but in the book, I know you have it in there. It's also on your website from what I'm aware of
That's right.
the sheet. But yeah, just drawing out the facts and then seeing what stories we make up about the facts. And yeah, I mean, for me, it's been very transformational as a practice. So I think it's huge. And I can also become aware of which of my stories, to your point, Deb, I argue and want to be right about, which is very interesting.
Right. Even in the situation you were describing, so if you're going to, from a high level, without going into more detail than you want to, if we were going to say around the situation with spending time or caring for your parents, could you identify now even what's something you're wanting to be right about unconsciously that's kind of driving the tension? Can you find something in that scenario?
Yeah, right away it came up, because the fact would be X sibling is spending this amount of time or this amount of effort. My story is they should be doing more or less. And so that part, and I can feel it gets me riled up.
Yeah. What a humble thing to acknowledge. Yeah. Here's a fact. They spend X amount of time with parents. But then the story you make up is sibling ought to spend more time. And then we get attached to being right about that. And then the conversation we have with sibling or colleague winds up being somehow more confrontational.
Right.
Or we avoid it because we don't want to have confrontation at work and at home. Rather than, hey, when I tuned in to what the big picture I see going on with our parents, here are the things I'm concerned about. Here are the things that I want to see and get creative. What about you? That blame and criticism gets in the way, actually, of having a creative conversation because we make it personal. Oh, I'm judgmental, so I don't want to say anything.
Mm-hmm.
Or we make it
Mm-hmm.
personal about the other person.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just so, I just appreciate your courage right now, even to say, your face even pinked up as you said it, to really acknowledge, oh yeah, I'm over here shoulding this
Right.
person in my life. I'm judging.
Mm-hmm.
They're
Mm-hmm.
just over there doing them, but I'm over here sitting in a seat of judgment. And that impacts the conversation we can have or not have.
Yeah. Yeah.
Brilliant, Jonathan.
Thank you. Yeah. And I noticed what's interesting is when I go into that wanting to be right or the criticism, I can feel the physiology changes, right? I can, to your point, the redness, I can feel the chemistry change of the stress response coming on, like you mentioned, because it's not like I'm being threatened by a tiger or something, but it's a very subtle stress response of wanting to be right, which is very fascinating.
Yeah, that's why I make up the story that attachment to wanting to be right is on par with like some emergency that would send someone to a hospital kind of emergency. You see so-and-so's name in your inbox, and all of a sudden you get an adrenaline dump.
Right.
You think about having a conversation, or you think about the scenario with your parents and what siblings are and aren't doing. And then all of a sudden there's a chemical cascade associated with like a saber-toothed tiger coming after
Mm-hmm.
you.
Mm-hmm.
But all it was a story in your mind about a potential future. So we need to so again, the reactivity, we got to handle that, take a look at it, learn from it. What's it pointing to? Was there fear in the system that might be alerting us to some emotional intelligence, some data around how to approach? Is there anger in the system? That's got another data set of intelligence to unpack. Is there sadness in the system, in that cascade,
Mm-hmm.
sensationally and emotionally? And then that sadness has a whole other data set of intelligence for us. And we talk about all of this in commitment number 3, which is our discussion on EQ in the workspace and as leaders.
Yeah. Yeah. Appreciate that. And yeah, where this is informing me to go next is when, because you mentioned, for example, in my case, if I chose to sit here and blame and criticism, and I chose not to reveal myself, or another way to say that is actually come forward and express, how I'd like to maybe be closer or resolve whatever it might be, or even reveal my judgments. If I don't do that, can you speak to the impact or the effect? And again, it's not wrong if I don't do that, but it more so the effect or the impact long term of not coming forward with that.
Right. That's so good. So much like humanity in this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things we talk about in our commitment around candor is that what most humans are doing most of the time is, when a technical term here again, when a something happens, I'm kidding, something
Mm-hmm.
happens, whatever that is, you get an email, you hear from the sibling, it's been 5 days since they saw the parents, whatever, something happens. When we don't talk about it in the moment, we call that a withhold. We start to withhold our true selves from each
Mm-hmm.
other. We sweep it under the rug. Nah, it's not that really big of a deal. Or it is, but I don't want to deal with it. All the variety of ways we might handle it. And then what happens is, once we have that withhold, we start to withdraw a little bit from the relationship. Maybe we don't squarely look someone in the eye the way we used to, or maybe even as much as we might not reach out to them the way we might, whether it's a family member or you didn't like the tone of an email from a colleague at work, and then you need something from them for the project, but you've got this withhold, so you don't reach out because you've withdrawn a little bit. And then what happens is we start to project. So we project the story we believe about that person. So for example, if you have a story that a sibling isn't spending as much time as you think they ought to with a parent, then you start collecting evidence of how true that is.
Right. Yeah.
Looking at the calendar, talking to the parents, when's the last time you saw so-and-so? And even unconsciously, what we do is we start dismissing evidence to the contrary. And we will miss that they just spent time with that person, or we'll miss data because we're in this withhold, withdraw, project narrative. We don't wake up in the morning and say another day to withhold, withdraw, and project on people. Nobody does that.
Right.
But it's sort of the subtlety of our coping mechanisms and our default behaviors. It's what all humans are doing, I think, until we do something else.
Yeah.
And so the something else that we recommend, rather than withhold, withdraw, and project, is something we call reveal, connect, and own. So it would be, rather than withholding, hey, you know, I'm starting to be concerned about how much time we're giving to the parents. We might, instead of withholding that, we might say it. Hey, could we have a conversation about how we're caring for our parents and the time we're spending with them? And and then we might connect, you know, have the conversation that we're not having with some vulnerability, with some transparency, and then own. The own part might be, hey, I just want to let you know, I've just been in some reactivity. I've just been over here kind of scared and angry and in some judgment. And I realize that's not helping our relationship. It's not helping the family structure. And so I just want to take responsibility for, I checked out a little bit in the connection, and I'm checking back in. I'm coming back in. I'm leaning back in where I had leaned out. So, I mean, I can see like 3 situations in my life I'm doing that right now. You know, it's just the withhold, sweep it under the rug. But then we have these death to relationship by 1,000 paper cuts. And whether it's in family relationships or in team dynamics, it winds up becoming a lumpy foundation that creates instability in the relationship now, and the potential of where the relationships are going to go, whether it's family dynamics or we're talking about long-term team projects within, you know, an organization. That stuff just gets in the way.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, can you speak a little bit, because I love the way you framed it out, and from what you've seen, how have you seen that impact not only team dynamics, but then on a broader level, like culturally within the organization?
Yeah. Well, a good example we were talking about before was, you know, I was working with one of my clients in a, you know, executive VP function, and he was getting feedback from his team that that he's not hearing them. And an example was a colleague sent him a text. We're going to have a meeting in November. And the next day, when he saw his colleague, he said, okay, great. So we're going to have this meeting and we need to talk about when are we going to get together to talk about it? The colleague was really frustrated and said, didn't you get my text? We're going to meet in November. And so what we discovered was that my client, when he saw the text, immediately was scared and angry because they had a deadline before November that he needed input on. And he was scared and angry that his colleague wasn't on the same page, didn't see the gravity of the situation and the same urgency. But he was also just in his default coping mechanism. Don't be scared, don't rock the boat, don't be angry.
Right.
So he just forgot. It was as if he never saw the text. Just in his denial coping mechanism strategy, it never happened. And that is one of his coping mechanisms, is he just doesn't register things that he's not in agreement with, or that he's scared about, or he's scared about being angry about. And so what happens is he's over there, his colleagues are frustrated, and he's not bringing forward the intelligence of November's too late. If we wait till November 1, we miss a deadline at the end of October. We need to meet sooner than that. So we miss his intelligence that the reactivity had for him because he skipped over it. And then there's, frustration and some difficulty in the team dynamic.
Yeah.
So what I heard actually was the next day he went and owned all of that with his team, and it wound up moving the project much sooner. The connection and trust on the team went way up because he owned, you know what, I now remember I saw the text, but I forgot about it because I was just too scared to bring it up.
Wow.
So the team trust increased. The project actually is now going to stay on deadline through the courage and vulnerability to employ these practices.
Right, to come forward and own it and reveal. Yeah. So it's pretty clear of not doing that. Not only does it have an impact on us as individuals, but the team is also now not receiving us fully. And yeah, I can just see the cascade effects of that.
Right. So trust goes down when we don't do that. His colleagues weren't trusting him to receive information. They texted to him.
Yep.
And his trust of, are we all on the same page? We've got this deadline. But all of that had been unspoken until it was spoken. So now we're seeing his team dynamics improve, trust is up, and the project is moving forward.
Yeah, that's so good. Awesome.
I'm really proud of them.
I'm looking at time, Deb. So we'll start to land the plane, and to me, it's just painted a beautiful picture. And I hope that listeners have taken away, one, not only how you define it, but also just really key distinctions and practices. And I mean, first and foremost, how you defined it, conscious leadership, just being one, conscious in the present moment in a non-triggered state. And the leadership part is being willing to take responsibility for our influence on the world. And a huge part of what you mentioned with the first commitment is taking ownership, taking full responsibility and laying out what that looks like. And then the second commitment of curiosity. And I love that how you went deeper into how trying to be right, or being, in my case, sometimes I'll say like being addicted to being right.
Yeah.
Actually holds us back from that. So in the last few minutes, I'm just curious, anything else you would share to put a bow on top for now for the conversation, and also share if people are interested in going deeper with your work or the Conscious Leadership Group, how you can find them, how they can find you.
Sure. Such a pleasure to be with you, by the way.
Likewise.
I think one thing I would love for listeners to take away is being scared or in a reactive state. It's just utterly human. And when we try to skip over that, it just delays the inevitable. So if we can approach ourselves with some grace and space and acceptance for our reactivity, then we can de-escalate, maybe unpack the intelligence from the reactivity and come back into connection with ourselves and possibilities with those in our lives. So really embrace the reactivity and find some self-acceptance so that new possibilities can emerge. And for folks that want to learn more about our work at the Conscious Leadership Group, our website is conscious.is. And as you mentioned, we have a wealth of resources, open source available for the public, as well as services we offer one-on-one and to teams and leaders within the community.
Yes, super good stuff. Awesome, Deb. Well, this was amazing. I imagine if we had 4 hours, we can just keep going at it and go through all the commitments and all the good stuff. So really appreciate your time and your willingness to come on and have a chat, and also your vulnerability and your openness and being a demonstration of that which you teach. So thank you so much. And yeah, I look forward to staying connected with you.
Same here, Jonathan.
Yeah, until next time, Deb. Okay, great. That was a beautiful conversation. And we hope that you got some value from that. We'll put some links in the show notes. Thank you again for tuning into Navigating Now. Until next time.